Hello and welcome to yet another exciting episode of the Pharma Marketing Playbook, Data, Gen AI, and Beyond. Your go to podcast for mastering pharmaceutical marketing, data analytics, and AI trends. Join industry leaders as we explore cutting edge strategies, the role of emerging technology, and how data driven insights are transforming the pharma landscape. I am Saumya Prakash, co founder at Multiplier AI, and today we have a very special guest joining us, Miss Preeya Beczek. We are honored to have Priya with us today, who is a distinguished leader in global regulatory affairs and compliance and is the co founder and managing director of Beczek.com, a consulting operations and management firm known for guiding biotech and pharmaceutical companies globally through complex regulatory landscapes. With a bachelor's in chemistry with management and a master's in environmental strategy from the University of Surrey, she has certifications in coaching and Lean Six Sigma. Pia also brings a unique intersection of scientific expertise, process excellence, and leadership development. Her career spans critical roles at leading organizations such as Dow Chemicals, Parexel, Ipsen, and Pfizer, where she held senior positions in regulatory affairs and program leadership. From hands on regulatory projects to shaping future focused strategies, Priya's insights are rooted in more than just industry regulations and standards. She drives meaningful innovation, operational agility, and global compliance through the extensive work she has done in infrastructure building. She has worked across safety, quality, regulatory, and local affiliate domains. She also brings a deep commitment to coaching and mentorship, helping emerging teams and new leaders thrive in high stakes environments. We are thrilled to explore her journey today, take on her perspective on regulatory transformation, and most importantly, how AI is poised to reshape the future of regulatory affairs and compliance. So, the theme for today is reimagining regulatory affairs from regulatory compliance to competitive advantage. And welcome once again to the show, Priya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Samaya. It's lovely to be here with you and share my insights. And yeah, let's get started.
Right. So, let's start with your journey, Priya. From your early days in regulatory affairs to founding Bexec.com, what were the key experiences or turning points that shaped your journey in this path?
Yes, thank you, Samaya. So I really do have to start from the beginning. After my first 2 years at university, I was at an industrial placement at Dow Chemicals in Germany. So this is where I had the opportunity to travel away from the UK and base myself for a whole year at Dow Chemicals in the southwest of Germany, where I was in a role for environmental health and strategy and doing product stewardship. So this is where I really learned about regulations and how they shape our products, whether it's medication, whether it's products that we are using to store our food, or whether they are, more industrial products such as coatings and things like this that are used in paints and, road markings. So that's where I was working with epoxy resins as part of my chemistry degree. And that really opened up my eyes to, this bigger part that you wouldn't appreciate otherwise as a student around regulations, how substances are controlled, whether they are chemicals or medicines. There was, this global control. Then I went on to work with Parexel, where I learned about big clinical trials in my first part. And here, the enormity of these trials and very key indications that were being studied, let's say, around Crohn's disease and things like this, diabetes, HIV. These were the first few indications that came across my desk in early part of my career. And I think the final part that shaped my path and my career was when I was working with Ipsen. I managed to be involved in a product that was really key, where it was the first pediatric product, the first centralized procedure product, the first device product, the first product that was working across nearly 28 European member states. So this was a really big part of my career where I was involved in the clinical and labeling aspects of that product. And I could tell you so many more stories, Saumya, but those were really the three parts in my early career that shaped my path into regulatory affairs and where I am now.
Thank you for sharing that journey with us. You have held multiple senior roles, regulatory strategy, project management, leading large teams, complex environments. So definitely, the journey as a leader comes with its own set of lessons. And we would love to hear from you what were the leadership lessons that helped you transition into these roles, especially in highly complex regulatory environments.
Yes, thank you. And this is a question that I get asked quite often, and I had to think about this a little bit, to be honest with you, but it does come down to people in the end. For me, really it's about being able to educate and articulate things as a regulatory professional. Sometimes there are, other functions out there that might not understand what does the regulation or procedure say, what does that mean at an operational level, at a document level, what do we need to present in our data? And also being able to educate and articulate at the senior level, being able to talk about regulatory affairs, about the procedure or product at hand, and being able to turn that into a strategic narrative, a strategic story. So for me, it's about a balance between operational, know-how, being able to work with your peers in the matrix organization in clinical safety, supply chain commercial, but also being able to explain and educate and articulate at the strategic level with senior leadership, so that you can really follow the pathway but in a very efficient way. And I think everyone has different expertise and different perspectives. So how do you bring that team together to be able to move the one thing that's common amongst you, which is the product, whether it's at early stage development or late stage development? You've got to be able to work as a team, taking all of the things I've mentioned into perspective and being able to move forward as a team. Yeah, so that's very important. Yeah.
True. Teamwork is, I think, the foundation for such any kind of work in that sense. And complex team management, across borders, leading large teams, and again navigating the complex landscapes, I think requires a mix of practicality and domain knowledge. All grouped into one. And I know that that's a very great experience that you've shared with us. How various products were launched with large teams in that sense. I see that you also hold a certification, very interestingly, in life coaching. And do you think that in some way this actually influenced your leadership style while you were working on these complex, areas and practically working with people across borders? Was that something that helped you? And how did you support your team in developing themselves, in technical areas or maybe in other personality areas to be able to outperform themselves?
Yes, I think this is a very nice skill that if you can have this naturally as a person in any industry, then I think it's good to deploy that in your day-to-day work. And I'm talking about listening. So for me, what I learned through my life coaching certification, and I apply that now for the past 6, 7 years in my work, is really about listening, to people. And it comes back to the different expertise, different perspectives. If you're talking to a medical lead, they may have a background where they've worked in the medical profession. They might have been a physician or a healthcare professional in their previous career, so how do you bring their perspective in? And by listening to them and understanding them is very important. We talked about teamwork, how do you bring all these different perspectives into the same moment for that product or indication that you're working on? I think by listening, you are learning, but you're also teaching one another. So I always say to people that it's important to meet each person where they are at. One person might be really advanced, they completely understand the disease, the prognosis, the demographics, and they're very into their domain area of clinical lead or medical lead or TA head, whereas there may be other people in your team who are perhaps junior or a little bit on the outside, and they may not have the full understanding. So you've got to meet people where they're at and explain to them in a way that they can understand. So I think my life coaching and mentorship really helps with this skill that often actually you don't notice that you're using this skill, but it's only when people give you the feedback then you are appreciating that they appreciate you. Yeah.
Right. I think, end of the day, listening is the one thing that if leaders do well, sometimes the answers may just be there, for most of our problems, but listening just makes the path forward and, it comes back from the team. So I think very rightly said, as leaders, I think our job is to listen more and understand and take the key decisions to our teams. And that's
Yeah.
very nicely put up. In today's fast evolving regulatory landscape, and specifically, coming from the healthcare industry specificity, there's so many complexities today, when it comes to the concerns from regulators or concerns from patient safety perspective, data sharing, or physicians' perspective. The regulatory landscape has become much more complex as what it used to be maybe 10 or 20 years before, and this requires a lot of strategic shift in the thinking and the mindset
Hmm.
for various organizations. So, according to you and your perspective of having worked so many years in developed countries, what strategic shifts do you believe that such regulatory teams also need to adopt today to stay both agile, compliant, and relevant? Because I think both the things have to have a balance. We cannot be very hard lined on any regulatory compliance, and at the same time, we can't be very slow in adopting. So, what's your point of view?
Yeah, so Maya, this is a really important consideration and question, right? So when you look at the life sciences industry, the goals and objectives at the very high macro level are the same, right? It's about patient safety, compliance, accuracy, speed, right? Efficiency. These will be the keywords in any company's objectives. And I think that's where you've got to be able to think about these teams that are working and how they are working. Previously, you would have paper submissions, you would have very little technology, a lot of manual work. You would have submissions that are taken to the health authority building and delivered in person, for example, with the fees and the letter and this kind of thing, right? So there's this manual level of work. And this is not a long time ago, 10, 20 years ago. And in some countries, it remains still like this, right? So there's that aspect, but you've also got people's skills are evolving, they must evolve. You've got to be able to have people who can now adopt technology, how to use this technology, having the capability to learn something. It's a bit like the smartphone. How many people avoid a smartphone? Some people prefer Android, some people prefer iPhone because the interface is different. And it's the same with any technology in life sciences. You are going to have people who are preferring one way of working compared to another way of working. But with the shift in regulatory landscape, the new pharmaceutical legislation, the new device legislation, the new clinical trial regulation, certainly in the European side, also political landscape shift as well impacts us a lot in our way of working. Really, the teams have to stay agile and compliant in a way that they evolve their operating models. So you're still going to have the targets of being patient safety focused, compliancy, efficiency, speed, accuracy, etc. But it's the way that you mix the use of your people, technology, process, data and governance, and navigate the regulatory landscape by having a good mix of how those elements are used in an operating model. Those things that I've mentioned make up your operating model. Some companies will have a purely in-house strategy. Some companies will have a strategy where they will do some activities in-house, some will be, offshored capabilities, some will be with third-party providers and distributors, for example. Some models will be centralized, some will be decentralized. And I think in order to stay agile, compliant, and have the speed and efficiency will really depend on how you mix these different elements together to meet the need of your company, your geographical landscape and footprint, and your indications, right? The therapeutic areas and indications, you need the right expertise to be able to work and progress that product into the market and then keep it on the market. So I think there's got to be some focus there around being able to challenge each other, utilize the capabilities around you optimally. And that's all capabilities, not just system capabilities or AI and automation, but also people capabilities as well. So there's a lot to be said there, Samaya. I could probably talk about this for the whole podcast, but I know you have some more questions for me. So yeah, I hope that I answered this question in a way that's suitable.
I understand your perspective that it's such a complex matter and it's a combination of resources as you put, technology, people, and processes, all intertwined into one. And we need to keep our eyes on the goal and yet at the same time be agile because any delay is not going to serve the purpose. If it's too rigid as a system, it won't work, and if it is too loosely coupled, it may lead to unexpected outcomes. So,
Yes.
trading that fine balance is an art and a science. And I think that's where experience will always be needed from leaders like you. It's very difficult to tread that just with tech alone. I think it requires that human leadership component,
Yeah.
which will always be, I think, a part of the strategy. We also see there's a growing trend, or rather, a much needed focus on sustainability today in pharma operations. And you having studied environmental strategy and being from a regulatory perspective, what's your take on that? How do you see sustainability in pharma operations becoming crucial in the coming years?
Yeah, so just being around different places with different clients that I work with, you already see that there is a big push towards sustainability in the office environment, right? Things like recycling and having a nice green footprint. But that's basic things, right? That's basic. We, as normal people living in our community, are already doing that. And I think for pharmaceutical companies, what's really evolving and coming into play now is things like a reduction of waste, thinking about more efficient supply chain and logistical chains and how to manage that. Being able to supply the right amount of products to the right locations is a massive undertaking. So, how can you optimize this? And how can you still reach all the patients? So, that's something that is always, being looked at. More recently also, you will know, just by looking at different consortiums, different groups, that there is a big push towards evolving the way that our labeling is working. So reducing the size of your leaflet, for example, and your packaging in your product, making the electronic labeling, so that people can use a QR code to access the information that would be typically printed on a leaflet, and thus maybe reducing the size of that leaflet to have the information more accessible to those people that are able to access it electronically. And I wouldn't be surprised also if companies start to think about the packaging of their products. So if you take, for example, your blister pack where you've got the plastic and the foil with your tablet inside, that closed container system. Back in the days, you had glass bottles with all your tablets inside the glass bottle, and your glass could therefore perhaps be recycled. So I wouldn't be surprised where you might move back to this kind of packaging where plastic goes away and you might have slightly different way of packaging things. But there are so many pros and cons to doing that. And I think also looking at the manufacturing itself, how will companies evolve to moving more sustainable ways to utilize modern technology, even maybe green technology instead of burning fuel, instead of using water, maybe there is a way that there's a way to use rainwater or solar panels that can provide energy to the buildings where the manufacturing takes place. And how can you also make your manufacturing line more efficient as well? So there's so many different ways that companies can, let's say, adopt sustainable approaches. It's just a matter of whether it's done by choice or whether it's done through more of a controlled, regulated direction from the different regulatory bodies and agencies. So it's almost like watch this space to see there's more bigger leaps towards sustainability. Yeah.
That's great. And of course, the core theme of this conversation coming back to AI. I know we have covered areas of environmental strategy from an ESG perspective, and we also covered the regulatory landscape and the strategic shift. But among all these things, we have this dominant player called AI, and we see that increasingly it'll have much more practical applications in all areas, could be regulatory submissions or HA interactions or maybe multiple other areas. So I would like to know your thoughts on what you see are maybe the next 3 to 5 years going to be most impactful or rather relevant areas for AI applications in this space. What is your viewpoint?
Yes, thank you, Samaya. So, I think that AI is becoming very, very important in our space in life sciences. So, just in regulatory affairs, AI is already being used to help bring in information from external sources, regulations, guidelines, comparative products. And, a typical regulatory lead role is able to then use that information to make certain assessments and decisions about their product or their indication for their product. So there is a practical use of AI coming in where the AI agent is being used to bring the several sources of external information to build a picture and it for that person, for that regulatory lead to then be able to review that and make decisions. And so that's saving time, right? So instead of having to do manual searches, Google, health authority websites, electronic assessment reports from health authorities, looking across websites of other products, finding their label, the AI agent is able to do that for you probably in a few minutes by asking the right questions to the AI agent. But I think there's also a room here to talk about innovation in terms of automation. Often companies confuse between AI and automation, and I think it's worth saying that sometimes you're using AI to bring that information in, but then the second part of that process is to automate the generation of a draft document based on what that AI has brought in. So they're sitting side by side like brother and sister, right? And so simple things like taking clinical trial narratives and building your first draft of your clinical study report is a very common use case now used across industry. And this is how some companies are working to generate the first draft to, author that document. But I think, Sumaya, it's worth talking about the wider scope here as well. It's not just in regulatory, you have it across the functions that sit beside regulatory, so safety, quality, manufacturing, GMP level as well, where AI and automation can be really useful to help to bring the speed where perhaps somebody's doing something manually at the moment. So yeah, I think industry is at a point where they are exploring, working with companies to pilot different software, to learn how this is working and see how it can bring value to their team and organization. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I see your point, because each of the areas that you mentioned, for example, submissions, again, that's a long process, and we need to comply at every step with certain guidelines. So if we have AI as a added advantage, a lot of time could be saved so that required checklists are taken care of, required documents are all, there's nothing which is missed out because sometimes these checklists missed out or any submission which is missed out, can take a couple of months to get back into the same place. So AI could help in vetting that priorly. And the other area which you mentioned was interactions. I think again communication interactions with the HCPs, the healthcare professionals, those communication channels could be much more customized. And we see that clearly as a need. As a practitioner of AI at Multiplier AI, we've seen that multiple clients are looking and exploring those options so that much more personalized messaging can go out than trying to put it. And this is personalization at a level of a person's individual scientific and his practice outlook. So what kind of patients he's looking into, what kind of research he's interested into, and all those stuff, which makes that we can make the message so much more relevant and a value add for him, rather than just kind of push whatever data or whatever information I have today. So more than a push model, it's more a reception oriented model where I give relevant information that can actually add value in that particular person's role or in that person's job. And it can again have a final value advantage for the patients. So I think that's where the industry is looking at, that how do we trickle down so many thousands of years of knowledge across various parts of the value chain, right? From research to submissions to operations and sales or maybe patient outreach. How do we combine all this relevant information scattered right now in the ecosystem and use this much more intelligently? And I think that in itself will be such a game changer, path breaker. So that's what I got a sense from what you are
Yes.
trying to communicate.
Yes, exactly, Samaya. And I think that as we move towards a more patient-centric approach, you've got so much information out there, and it's really hard for anybody to know where to look for that information. So using AI as a way to go and find that information and then present it in a way that's understandable, that can be traced back perhaps to where it came from, but most importantly, that it is relevant to the person who is seeking that information is very important. And so there is an element where you need to be able to understand how to ask your AI the right information. And so that information is then brought to you in a relevant way. And that I call that a feedback loop actually. So you feed in, you find the information, and then you can further interrogate and refine this information as needed. And that's the really the very smart part of AI in the way it is can be used across those domains that you mentioned around research, operations, regulatory affairs, sales, commercial, and how it's out then in the public domain to be used by the patients or potential patients themselves. Yeah.
Right. And coming to a more practical framework, when organizations look for preparing or adopting AI solutions for their key vital processes and their day-to-day operations, what do you suggest as kind of guardrails that we can keep it in mind? How can we optimize our operating models, or do you think we need to look at a new operating model altogether? So, what's your take? Should we improve from where we are, or should we redo the whole thing? What's been your experience like?
Yeah, this is very good question, Samaya. The two or three things that I would want to talk about here is that it's very important to go back to those objectives that we talked about at the top of our podcast. The objectives are always going to be the same: patient safety, compliance, accuracy, speed, efficiency. Okay. And so when you think about those, you can think about them at the very micro level, so at a functional process level. For example, if we take the submission management process end to end, you plan, you according to your strategy and regulations, you then develop the content or your documents, you then compile and publish, you submit, you have health authority, questions perhaps, maybe not, maybe yes, you respond, you get your outcome from your health authority. It's a typical end-to-end submission management process. You may have some follow-up things that constitute into some sort of commitment at the end to the health authority. But it's standard process. Okay, every single industry member will follow this process, whether they are running it or using it or following it, doesn't matter. And here you can then ask your team and go, well, where would you benefit from going faster? Where would you benefit from being more accurate? Where would you benefit from having efficiency? Where is there currently human manual intervention that may cause errors to creep in, where you're seeking more accuracy? And therefore, does this overall help with compliance and patient safety, because your information in the documents, in the data level, are correct and accurate? So where I'm going to with this is that in that end-to-end process where you're looking for these objectives, where is the value, right? If you can already do something quite quickly anyway, and your gain is not very big, you don't need to necessarily think about automation and AI. But if you think there is something that's really manual, needs a lot of hours for small output, you would then go, okay, there is a value add here at this part of the step. So starting at the functional level process is my first advice. My second advice and industry insight is to look across domains. It's a little bit like we were saying earlier. Where can you use AI that ties up your domains, from data generation, so research, clinical studies, your biomarkers, your tox studies, etc. There's lots of data that companies generate even before they hit the market. And if you could draw a line and be able to do your data lineage across from early research, late research to submission, and be able to trace back all the things you submitted and the data points you submitted, could you trace them back to your research? Most companies cannot trace this back. Then if your product is on the market with labeling, your manufacturing site is now producing this bulk and it's now in the domain, and you've got signal detections, safety signals, etc., feedback loop, can you trace that back to your first part of your chain in terms of data lineage, data pooling, data lakes? Also, what worked, what didn't work? Where can you change and update your product profile based on the data that you have now from the patients and people taking your medication? To me, that's the ultimate end to end. So it's not an end to end within a function, but an end to end for your whole value chain. And if you could use AI and automation to give you smart information for that whole end to end chain, then you're really looking at something that's going to be very useful for the pharmaceutical industry. And there are several use cases there. And so you'd have to join up the use cases to be able to really benefit from the insights you would get in that end to end. And in terms of supply to the right people to the right time, personalized medication, how can research data and clinical trial data inform you for personalized medication for a particular patient in a particular country with different diseases amongst the one you're trying to treat? How can you really personalize this for that person? And that can only come from data, and that's where AI can really play a big role. Right. So I could talk about this for a long time, Saumya. I'm sure you and I would have to do a separate podcast just for this. And yeah, so that would be my thing, is to look at where's the value add and think of the bigger picture. Yeah.
I think that sums it beautifully. Look at where the value add is maximized and how do you look at entirely fitting into the big objective for the organization. And how would you suggest to do process optimization, or any suggestions for regulatory teams to be more efficient? Especially because many times regulatory teams are under tremendous pressure, with the deadline of filings, and suddenly notifications could come in. So these sometimes could be really nerve wracking. So you have been Lean Six Sigma as well. What's your thought process here?
Yeah, I think there's got to be some basic things here for teams to work in an optimal way, be more efficient in order to navigate the complex landscapes of our regulations across the globe. there's got to be some real basic things that have to be in place and have to be in place properly. So often people don't understand their roles and responsibilities. I think that's got to be really clear. There's got to be also a balance between process and system. There are teams that will have great processes, but they do things manually. So they haven't adopted a system and tools and automation and technology that allows them to work their process through that system and technology capability. Where, for example, if you have a 10-step process, maybe 5 or 6 of those steps can be conducted in a system or via AI or automation. So really break it down and think about that so that you can take the pressure off those more manual steps. I think there's also got to be understanding of where are the handoffs. When you're working in a matrix environment, you've got to be sure you know where is the information coming, what do I need to do to it, and then who's the next person in line. In a life sciences industry and pharma industry, you always have, there's a handoff. It's like a relay race, you're handing the baton to other people, right? So where are those handoffs? And as part of those handoffs, what are the decision steps? When there is a handoff, there is a decision, there's a stage gate. Be aware, what is that stage gate? What's the go, no go decision? There is always a go, no go decision. And it's not linear, right? This is what makes it interesting and complex to work in our domain. And I think the other thing I want to say here is, if you're using your process, your people, your systems, your roles and responsibilities, the only other element you've got to be very mindful of is the data. So when you've got your system, you've got your data inside the system, you've got your documents inside the system, it has to be authoritative. If you've got duplication, things sitting outside the system, some things sitting inside the system, you're creating double work. That's not efficient. So everybody must be focused on their systems and how they should be used, and expectations should be set by the organization on what the systems are, which ones are authoritative, so that you can really maximize the use of these systems and tools, right? AI tools, automation tools, regulatory information systems, document management systems. And then you are really taking advantage of this to give yourself time as a professional to be more in the strategic part, the scientific part, the decision making part, the educative part, because your process is running in your system and the operational aspects are perhaps also working in a way that can utilize that. So it's really making sure that everyone is focused in those areas that I've mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of good points for us to kind of share with the industry leaders. And coming back, you've worked, I think, across US, UK, global markets. So, what is your advice on some of the challenges that companies face when they're scaling across regions? Any advice that you would like to give, or any thoughts on that for global scaling?
Yeah, I think you're always going to have companies that have their comfort zone, right? Where in the geography area that they are working in or where they started, now suddenly they want to expand across regions, across geographies. And for me, what I've learned and observed across my career over the past 26 years is that always find the right partners in those markets, in those regions. Form a relationship where you have the right vision and goals to expand, whether that's a one single person or a team or a research organization or a distributor, even another company that you want to partner with because they have presence in that market or region. It's really important to partner with people and teams that are like-minded and you can work with them. Never underestimate this kind of chemistry that you can have with people and partners. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is, make sure you do your research. You can't just penetrate different markets and regions without knowing the ground, knowing the space, knowing the regulations, the pathways, and being ahead in that learning. You might have a really brilliant injection, for example, but you need to look at the device element or you might need to look at the pediatric regulations in that region. They will be very different. You might need to look at the disease prevalence in that region, and also understand that you may have taken a certain regulatory pathway in your region, but in another new region, the regulatory pathway is different. It's longer, it's more complicated. You need to do more studies or more equivalent studies or bioequivalent studies or new clinical trial in that new population. So there's going to be always things that you will uncover. And I think that's very important to do your research, but then have that partner to help you navigate that landscape in those regions. And I think that it sounds really silly, but visit, go and see people in those areas. You will break down so many of those early barriers by going and seeing and being in that environment where you are planning to penetrate into as part of your growth. And learn from what you've discovered. Make sure you have a way to do feedback and learning in that region. So yeah, I think that would be my advice to teams that are expanding.
I think that's great advice for scaling. And a lot of young professionals listen to this podcast. They may be looking forward to building a career in regulatory affairs, just like how you have done it over your years of experience. So, what would you advise them in this ever changing industry now? How should they grow into strategic leadership roles like how you have done? And what could they learn in their journey? What's your viewpoint?
Yeah, so getting into regulatory affairs is really quite good these days. There's pathways you can do, different courses and even degree courses that give you a leg up into your first regulatory role. But until you hit the ground, hit that first job, you will not really know, because you're working with complex teams and complex regulations, as we've already talked about, Samaya. So I think learn the basics. That would be my first advice. Work in an environment where you have the opportunity to learn all the basics around the regulations, the procedures, and once you know that, then you can also think about perhaps an area or two areas maybe that you would like to be specializing in. Is it clinical? Is it chemistry, manufacturing and control? Is it labeling? Do you want to do operational work, submission management, publishing, etc., where you are closer to the technology that we've talked about? So think about that. And there's no right or wrong. You can be operational and then move into strategic roles, or you from operational roles into line management roles. There's no wrong or right. I think the other thing is speak to people. Now you have so much available to you. You've got LinkedIn, you've got conferences, you've got free webinars, you've got your way to just connect with people directly. And so, speak to people, attend external events, and read and listen to accessible information. This podcast is a good example. People can listen to this, they can pause the podcast, they can listen to it again. I think this is really great information and education that's available free to people. To take it, right? And then also, I think the other thing, advice that I would give people is be strategic and scientific and operational, but also have good business acumen. And that goes with any role. I think the young people coming into the role, you've got to have good business acumen. You've got to be able to articulate yourself, and don't be shy, ask questions, and learn how to really express your knowledge in regulatory affairs in a way that is meaningful and understandable to others. And here, look, we've come right back to the top where we started talking about this at the very beginning. And I think for me, that's the main core skill that I feel that I have, is to be able to take lots of information and present it and talk about it in a way that you hope most people will understand and take away clear next steps from that information. So that would be my kind of advice to people who are starting out. Samaya, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Priya. I think it's a fantastic episode for us at Pharma Marketing Playbook, where your journey through the world of regulatory strategy and global compliance has shared with us incredible insights. and specifically your perspectives on leadership, innovation, and the evolving role of technology in pharma and also the future that it has for us. They have been like truly invaluable insights, I must say. So thank you once again for giving your insights and your time for this podcast. To our listeners, we hope this episode offers you powerful takeaways and a renewed understanding of the regulatory landscape and its impact on healthcare innovation. Until next time, this is Saumya signing off. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep learning. Keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in pharma marketing. Thank you, Priya. Thanks everyone for joining us for the show today.
Yeah, thank you very much.